Hello, everyone. Welcome to our webinar, Bridging Personality, the bridge between personality and a safe work environment. We're just going to give everybody a few minutes to be able to join, where I'll introduce our speaker as well as go over just some housekeeping items to be able to get you there. So, stay tuned. We'll just give everybody a couple of minutes to join. Once again, thank you everybody for joining. We'll be promptly starting in just a minute. We're just giving an opportunity for others to come on, making sure that they're able to join. And again, we're really happy and we're really excited to be able to present you the bridge between personality and a safe work environment presented by Hogan. So we'll just kind of wait until the clock ticks to 11:02. Before we kick off our session. And, at any time, and we will go over some of the housekeeping items, but if you have any questions, anything that you'd like to ask, there is a chat option available to you that you're more than happy to be able to take advantage of. If it's a question that I may hold off to the end of the presentation, or if it's relative to what we were talking about at that point, I will present that over to Dustin and get his answer. All right, now that it is 11:02 and keeping mind of everybody's schedule, thank you very much for joining. Again, you've joined the Bridge Between Personality and a Safe Work Environment presented to us by my friends over at Hogan. I'd like to, just to mention a couple of things. There are a few polling questions that come up. Feel free to be able to, insert yourself in, ask those questions so we can get very proper polls and we'll be able to share that information in terms of what we're hearing from everybody. If you have any questions and answers or questions at any point, we're happy to answer them. I will either interrupt Dustin during his speak and ask, or at a maximum, hold it off to the end. So at this time, I'd like to welcome Dustin over to our webinar. Dustin is a member of the Hogan Assessment team based out of Oklahoma. He's got a master's in educational psychology and an MBA from Oklahoma State University. Go Cowboys, where a lot of his research is centered on graduate training effectiveness, resilience, among other at-risk populations. But, at the same time, Dustin has designed and implemented leadership development programs, selection-based assessment systems with high potential, other talent management activities right across a wide variety of organizational applications. Dustin's been kind enough to come on and present other webinars where we talk about a walk on the dark side that is, that was covered off before and that it is available for you to listen to. But we have a lot of our safety related industry, asking for how can we talk about, what can we learn more about personality and how it affects safety. Anyways, with nothing else to be said, Dustin, over to you.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Jag. Thanks a lot, everybody, for being here. As again, Jag mentioned, my name's Dustin Hunter. I've been with Hogan about 9 years now and been fortunate the entire time to work with our amazing distributor network. So again, appreciate D-TECK for inviting me on the call today. And what we initially thought was that, perhaps it might be useful to talk about some different links or some different avenues by which personality can be used to predict workplace performance. And in this case, for the purposes of today, we thought, what better relevant topic for today than to talk about safety and the links that personality can drive with safety. So most of you on the call will know who Hogan is. You probably wouldn't be here unless that was the case. But if you don't, Hogan Assessments, what we do is we provide personality assessments. Hogan was actually the first assessment company to use a Big 5 personality assessment to predict occupational success or occupational performance. And we've been doing that for about 30 years. So we've got a really robust job archive. We've got, I think at this point, over 9 million people have taken the Hogan. So again, a lot of experience and a lot of research, a lot of data collected in this area. So again, I know I'm probably preaching to the choir there. But just to get us started for today, Jag and I thought that we'd kick it off by asking a poll question just to give us a really quick idea around, the safety topic and around sort of the prevalence or incident rate at which organizations in Canada are using safety. So for the first poll question, if you wouldn't mind, and this is up on the screen now thanks to Zach, do your organizations track the number of days without incidents or accidents? So let's take a few seconds and weigh in on that one.
We'll just take a second to close the vote to get you those answers, Dustin.
Okay.
And 71% of people, sorry, I'm sure you see that. Go ahead.
Yeah. It looks like for the majority of the group that yes, they do. And obviously for some of you that might not be relevant. For instance, here at Hogan, we don't track accidents. Maybe we should. Maybe it's vehicle accidents. We'll check. But it looks like, again, for most of you, it's the case. So this is good news. It means that from an organizational standpoint, you're deploying measurements and hopefully using some sort of a diagnostic or some sort of assessment in that process by which you can build interventions and start to measure whether or not you're moving the needle. And at Hogan, what we say is that assessment of any kind, personality, safety, cognitive, whatever it might be, has a job to do, and that's to predict an outcome, to predict success in some area, to predict non-test behaviors, how Hogan would describe that. So hopefully whatever assessment potentially that you're using, it's actually predicting non-test behavior, which in this case would be safety behaviors. But again, really comforting to know that majority of the organizations are actually using safety or at least some sort of a safety awareness in the workplace. It's actually a great segue into our next topic in the presentation, which is that we do see that as prevalent across many geographies. At Hogan, we've got, as I mentioned, I'm a part of the distributor network. We've got 40 distributors that operate in about 50 different countries. And so the case here in Canada, majority of you having experience in your organization with some sort of safety assessment, right? That's not necessarily new. It's not necessarily unique to North America even. What we do know is that workplace accidents cost a lot of money, and that organizations spend just as much money on safety. And in terms of safety, we might be talking about safety development programs, which we'll talk about a little bit later in the presentation today. It could be safety assessments, it could be safety awareness or cultural training, right? So we know that there are two categories there where a lot of money is being spent. And what we want to do essentially is position that money spent as proactive rather than reactive. To have a position where we're actually implementing some sort of effective and empirical safety intervention before an accident happens. And we'll go through a couple of those examples, the real world examples and case studies later today in the presentation. But essentially, the question of this, and this is sort of the million-dollar question apparently, is that, or billion in this case, accidents are still happening, regardless or despite the fact that organizations are spending a lot of money on this. And the question really is, why is that? Why is that the case? And to track that back, I think it really begs the question of looking at where we're starting here, is how are we attacking this equation in terms of why all these accidents are still happening, why we still hear about major accidents and incidents in the news. And I think it can, and essentially, not to be reductive, but boil down or track back to the conventional wisdom of how organizations look at safety. And traditionally, that research and focus hasn't really helped us. It hasn't really solved the problem, right? So the wisdom conventionally is that on-the-job training is really the best route or the best mechanism by which to orient employees to better safety behaviors, right? And that organizations have a financial or ethical obligation to provide that training so that you can prevent accidents from happening in the future. What we know, though, the reality of this, and in terms of dollars spent, is that training really hasn't moved the needle on that, and that has some really big cost implications in terms of insurance, lost time on the job due to accidents or downtime for machines, right? And organizations are ignoring the fact, and this is really the key takeaway here, that a worker's personality directly contributes to the reason why accidents are continuing to happen. So progress in workplace safety and organizational health are advancing more quickly by essentially structuring this argument into three main areas, again, focusing back on the worker's personality having a direct impact, the culture of the work engagement, and then the organizational leadership around the topic. So we've got three broad areas there by which we can shift the conventional wisdom to where it actually meets reality and where we're actually seeing things happen in the workplace. So again, back in terms of the worker personality component, we have at Hogan, through our personality assessments, the ability to measure individual safety behaviors and predict which of those safety facets will be most exhibited by individuals. And so again, that's the key piece of this that we'll focus in on today, not to say that the others, the culture and the leadership attitude towards safety aren't important. It's just that in terms of Hogan, we can lend a lot to this three-part equation in the personality space of the individual. So our safety assessment, we're looking at individual participant scores along 6 safety dimensions. We'll talk about those here in a few minutes. And we actually produce an overall score, an overall safety score for that particular person. And that's useful for a few different reasons. It's obviously useful for helping you select workers on the front end that are going to be better at, let's say, safety attitudes and awareness than others. So we're talking about screening individuals that are likely going to be more safe on the job. But also from a development perspective as well, the same data can be used to help drive some safety awareness interventions or safety training and development or coaching, right? By understanding a little bit about what drives that individual and their personality, we can start to better understand where we need to start from an organizational perspective, especially when you're looking at that data in aggregate. And you're rolling up, let's say, the safety assessment results of in a manufacturing organization of people on the front line or on the assembly line, that is, okay? So let's jump right into poll question 2. Jag, do you want to introduce this one?
Yeah, I'd love to. Thank you. How would you describe people who you would describe as accident prone? Would you see them as defiant, panicky, irritable, distractible, reckless, arrogant? We'll give everybody a few seconds to be able to answer just before we close this. And again, if you have any questions at any time, please feel free to kind of send them through the chat, which is just there at the bottom of your screen. And we'll go ahead and bring up questions as required. And again, this is a multiple answer question, and you can select more than one. So again, are people being seen as defiant, panicky, irritable, distractible, reckless, or arrogant? And just as we're about to close this, we'll just give it kind of another 10 seconds. And again, if anybody has any questions, please use the chat function to be able to reach out to me. But again, defiant, panicky, irritable, distractible, reckless, and arrogant, you're able to pick more than one. And I think it's coming about time we close this. And the answer is, wow, distractible is overwhelmingly the largest response. Over to you, Dustin.
Okay, no, thank you. And again, thanks to everybody for responding. And again, we're not sharing names here. So, I'm glad that everybody was able to participate. And so again, from the safety dimensions perspective, what we did here was to actually seed the poll with the 6 safety dimensions that we'll talk about from the Hogan Safety Report. And in general, I think it's just a good exercise to start talking about, again, from an organization or from a large group perspective, are there some common characteristics for employees in an organization that could be contributing to a large part or a large degree to accidents? And this is essentially the starting place for organizational climate surveys around safety. What you're doing is you're asking the employees, especially the employees that are engaged with safe-related behaviors, You know, if you're talking about an oil rig, you're talking about the people that are actually working on the rig, not the people that they report to, potentially that are managers, right? The people that are actually dealing with the dangerous parts of the job. We do a lot in shipping and transportation and freight, so it'd actually be the drivers there. But again, you're surveying people around their attitudes, around how potentially they perceive themselves to be a safe worker or not. And then again, what's the organizational culture for some of these different safety dimensions? And here for distractible, that's just interesting. To me, that's the most, or the most popular. So again, most people would say people that are accident prone are distractible. So let's go ahead and look at how this plays out. So again, linking it back to personality and safe behavior, a statistical relationship exists. So a correlation exists between somebody's personality and how they're rated in terms of likely to be safe on the job. So their safety-related job outcomes. And that could potentially come in the form of supervisor ratings. It could come in the form of actual accident data that we can collect from organizations. So the job outcomes piece can vary quite a bit just in terms of the quality of data that the organization collects. But again, people who are accident prone tend to be described in these 6 common ways. The group today said distractible, but again, think about these broader dimensions. So, right, inattentive to details, that's pretty easy to see why that could lead to some potentially negative safety outcomes. And I'm going to link that one up with unreliable and having difficulty following the rules. So that particular combination, inattentive and maybe not necessarily going to be somebody that's going to follow the rules. Think back potentially to your Hogan training, your Hogan certification workshop, if you're familiar with our scales, because again, this is driven by our Hogan HPI. What I would say is that's probably a pretty good link back to prudence on the main scale level. So again, lower prudence, lower details, and rule following. Inability to handle stress, that's a really important one. So, and we'll see some examples here in a minute, but what does that look like on the job? Somebody that gets flustered, right? Somebody that gets easily irritated, right? Unable to handle a lot of stress. For certain jobs, and again, this is a key point, this is all job context specific, I'm going to want some different safety personality characteristics from my air traffic controller than I am with my journeyman, right, from the oil and gas company, or the guy on the assembly line, right? These will all be job context specific, and we can work through some of our different surveys to help understand which of these are more important, which of these dimensions are predicting safe outcomes. But just to round out the list, we've also got unable to adapt to changing work conditions. I'm going to link that one back to also probably prudence or adjustment, right? So difficulty being flexible. Having difficulty working with others is also important. And this would be more related back to interpersonal sensitivity on the Hogan, and then being overly outgoing or wanting to be the center of attention, right? Talking a lot, also links back to not really paying attention, that sociability. And that's just getting a bit back into the weeds of Hogan, and we actually have subscales that predict each of these 6 safety competencies. So I don't want you to think that these are one-to-one relationships back in the algorithms to Hogan. They're not. We actually go a bit more fine-grained on those. But I wanted to share that with you just in terms of those who are using Hogan. This is essentially the link back to the Hogan language or framework from the Big 5. And the way that all looks then in aggregate, so the actual model of safety, what we're looking at is 6 main dimensions here that are contributing to an overall employee safety potential. And so we've been looking at this data for about 30 different years. This is actually where Hogan got our start. So we got our start, again, Jag mentioned we're in Oklahoma, so we're in Tulsa. And Oklahoma, for the U.S. anyway, is really the, I think, maybe not anymore, but before was considered the oil crossroads of the world, or the oil capital of the world. And that's not because a lot of oil is drilled here, even though it is. Oil and natural gas are a big part of our state's resources. It's because all the pipelines, even pipelines from Canada, all track back and flow right through Oklahoma, really close to Tulsa. Actually, it's a town called Cushing. But a lot of our data comes from the oil industry, and as a result of that, trucking companies. A lot of freight companies that had to ship that, a few decades ago. Now there's pipelines and it's much easier to get around. But that's really where we got our start, is looking at the links between personality and safety behavior. And so again, personality impacts safety behavior. We're looking at, does a worker panic under pressure? Does he ignore safety precautions? Is this somebody that becomes easily bored and stops paying attention, right? Has their own agenda, tries to finish work early to end the day, right? These are all different parts of this model that we can measure and predict through the HPI. All of these are on a 5-range normative scale. We'll look at that here in a second. And again, we're talking about influencing safety performance. I wanted to also show you the dimensions because I think it's important. So we've got the overall label, right? But at Hogan, all things are on a spectrum. We don't type people, and we don't assume that people are that simplistic, right? People are complicated, behaviors are complex. So we're talking about a range of behaviors on a spectrum. And these essentially are the poles, if you will, or the behavioral anchors on each end of that spectrum. So for compliance, we've got on the top end compliance, yes, concerning a person's willingness to follow the rules. But on the low end, we've got the opposite of that behavior, which again would be ignoring the rules, being defiant, wanting to do your own thing. High scores would be something that follow them effortlessly. So again, we wanted to include some really observational or reputational-based descriptors here so that it's pretty easy to determine for a particular individual where they might fall on one of these 6 safety dimensions, just by sheer nature of observing that individual, if it's somebody you work with, or if it's a group of people, what are the common characteristics? These are all potentially areas that you could, again, see and observe in a workplace. And as I mentioned just a few minutes ago, all of this is driven by our HPI. So the same HPI, what I would call the input, drives dozens and dozens of different outputs for Hogan. This is probably, in my opinion, our most unique output. So HPI is driving the safety, right? So normal bright side personality, day-to-day strengths, it's a measure of potential here. It's essentially a measure of you at your best. And HPI, because it's a day-to-day normal personality behavior, really helps us find and predict which of these types of behaviors are going to directly impact safety and essentially safety performance. Okay? So really quickly, let's get into a few real-world examples of when this doesn't necessarily go well. So we've presented the Hogan model. We've presented the 6 safety dimensions there. Let's look at some case studies here about when you've got a situation that goes from bad to worse in terms of different individuals, in some cases single individuals' reactions to stressful or safety events. So this is probably the most well-known. This event needs no introduction, right? Chernobyl, 1986. What we're seeing is the costliest accident in history. Large death tolls, large numbers. There's actually a great new, incidentally, documentary on this. It's not necessarily a documentary, but it's a docuseries on Chernobyl. I would recommend watching it. And when you do, remember now the plug for Hogan. So as you're going in and you see the meltdown happen on the very first episode, start to try and pinpoint some of those different safety behaviors because you'll see them. So again, what you'll see there is that the individuals there were not necessarily following the rules, but there were also people that were ignoring critical data from the machines. There were people there that were pushing their own agenda in terms of passing a particular safety test and pushing essentially the reactor to its breaking point. And again, ignoring the data that the machines were telling them, to the extent that this was, I think, the first of this type of nuclear reactor to ever melt down. And again, they took it to a point where, and you can attribute a lot of this back to arrogance and some of these safety dimensions we talked about, just pushing it to the limit, thinking they knew better, and again, wanting to accomplish their own agenda there. So again, one great example there. That one was around following procedures for how you should stress test the particular reactor, and they simply ignoring the rules. This is an incident, we'll call it handling stress. So linking back to the panicky, strong safety dimension there. A situation where in '09, a Continental aircraft crashed into a house in Buffalo. Everybody was killed on board. What you heard then on this very unfortunate accident on the black box recorder was a lot of chatter between the pilots and again, so not paying attention, right? And then a stressful event happens, something happens, right? Maybe it's a pressure change, maybe it's turbulence. Big event happens, they're talking, not paying attention, and then somebody makes a bold move, right? Pulls the nose of the aircraft up, causes the plane to stall and crash. So essentially panicked under pressure. You contrast that directly with this, which is a situation similar. This is on the positive side. I wanted to include a positive here. For emotional control, similar situation. We've got an aircraft here. This is Captain Sullenberger here, who landed, that commercial aircraft in the Hudson successfully. Everybody got out. Everybody was safe. No fatalities, right? And on the black box recorder, you could hear, and on the transcript, and this is now a famous movie as well with Tom Hanks, but essentially you can hear how calm, cool, and collected this guy was under pressure. Talked the plane through it the whole time, and you could just see how he was dealing with this crisis, essentially every step of the way, very poised, again, very top end of that. This is a pretty recent incident as well, again, going back to unnecessary risk, this linking back to the reckless and cautious safety dimension. This happened in Italy, the Costa Concordia. You guys might have remembered this from the news, and it's a really outrageous picture there to see such a large a vessel just floating in a bay there. But essentially the captain, first of all, was arrogant and assumed that he could pull off a maneuver here in this very tight turnaround in very shallow water that everybody was saying he couldn't, because and it says there he knew the seabeds well. So again, going back to being reckless, he wanted to get out of there quicker. He had some agenda he was pushing, didn't take into consideration what other people and probably the boat was telling him in terms of data, thought he could do better. And then when the thing fell over, when the thing, capsizes, he jumps off. He's the first one off. He abandoned ship, and he's nowhere to be found. So again, reckless, and then doesn't stick around, to pay the consequences or to actually be the guy who's responsible for this. So again, think about this in terms of one person's behaviors, which are driven by their personality, creating a situation that is, just irreversible and can cause catastrophic damage or events. So this doesn't have to just be a really huge example like I'm presenting to you today. These are examples of certainly well-known examples of how one or just a few people can contribute to a huge catastrophic incident, but don't let that get lost in the fact that this can happen on an individual level on a much smaller scale. Just to wrap out the 6 safety dimensions here in these examples, the last one, differences between arrogant and trainable. So this is coming back to training and development. This is obviously a really famous example for us here. This is pretty close to home. This is the Gulf of Mexico for us. A situation where the Deepwater Horizon, now again another famous movie, we're starting to see a pattern, but what you're seeing is that the BP offshore drilling rig killed a lot of people, injured a lot of people, and I think probably are now seeing one of the most catastrophic environmental accidents from an oil spill perspective in modern history. And again, you can see when they track it back and they start looking at the safety records, they start looking at the safety climate on this particular rig. Half the workers are fearing reprisal for reporting unsafe behavior. And essentially when you dug into it, it's because they had a lot of top brass on the rig that day to celebrate a certain number of years without a lost time accident. So there was a lot of pressure on those individuals to not report up, to make sure that they were getting things done quickly. They were under-reporting incidents, right? They were pulling punches a little bit so they could make sure and get this award. Probably that had some, financial incentives in there for the people that were in charge of this rig. And essentially what you see the outcome here is, again, a few people, if you watch the documentary on this one as well, you had a couple of people on the rig that thought they knew better than the information that they were getting from all of the engineers that had poured the concrete on this thing and caused this huge catastrophic blowout. So a really, really sad situation. So again, Hogan Safety Report, what we're linking this back to is individual safety behaviors, and we don't necessarily always have to be talking about the Chernobyl of events, right? You scale it down to your business or the organization. One, it's important to think about from an individual perspective in terms of selection. So in terms of hiring in people that are more likely to be safe and exhibit positive safety behaviors at time one versus looking at it later and saying, well, gee, I wonder if we should have hired that person. And then two, the other application here is development. We talked about that, development and training. So a needs analysis of your current workforce and then integrate that with whatever it is that you're doing now. But all of that starts in both cases for selection and development with a diagnostic, right? Or with a tool by which you can measure different individuals' likelihood to exhibit safety behaviors. And so that's what we want to start with. So let's now take it, now that I've presented that, I'll have Jag take it to a chat question here. So we'll put this up on the screen. And if you wouldn't mind, this is a bit different from a poll. If you'll type in your answers directly to the chat. And sorry, Jag, I think you're muted on this one.
I am, sir. Thank you very much. Yeah, and again, the question is right here on the screen. What's the most important outcome in your organization's current safety programs and initiatives? And at the same time, is this measured or is it measurable? So you can just click on the chat button at the bottom of your screen and throw in some of your answers. And I'll be happy to present them over to Dustin and for everybody to listen to. I will keep the names off. So, this is a very can't seem to find a word for it. Oh my goodness, just let me. But anyways, again, what's the most important outcome in your organization's current safety programs and initiatives? And again, is this measured or is it measurable? I've heard back from a couple here. It seems to be pretty standard from both of them here. And they're saying some of the most important objectives that are coming out in their programs and initiatives is a lot of training and getting people ready. And is this measured? Again, and they have a measurable to it. But again, Dustin, what they're training for here, or what they're looking for here, is training individuals constantly, but at the same time, I'm also seeing that the programs or initiatives that they currently have around safety are, medical notes from their doctors to say, or medical tests in the organization to make sure that they can lift over 35 pounds. And, the other piece that they're looking at is really driver's abstracts and those types of items that are available that really do get attached to the recruitment aspect. What I'm hearing from some again are lower incident and accident in the workplace as low as possible. Another is reduce loss in time, reduce spending on safety.
Fantastic. Yeah, this is all fantastic input. What I think, and again, all great responses there. I think the comment around the driver's test, I think is a good analogy or a good example for the group to at least to key in on. So it's just another great example of how assessment has a job to do, and that's to predict non-test behavior. So your driver's test is a great example of an assessment trying to predict real-world behavior. So your driver's test, and you take this to, let's say, long-haul freight or long-haul truck drivers or hazardous freight drivers. We've done validation studies for all those groups. what you're doing is you're simulating different driving conditions. You're simulating the weight of a rig, stopping time, hazardous conditions on the road, weather, right? You're simulating all these things in an assessment to predict how that person will drive in the real world. You're doing that on a very short time scale, and you're basically saying, if you can pass this test, we feel confident and comfortable that you could be somebody that would have a high likelihood of exhibiting this in the real world. It's the same with a driver's test. In the U.S., it's at 16. A teenager can get a driver's license. They have a driver's test. They have a written, and they have an actual driver component. And again, what you're doing there is you're simulating all types of real-world outcomes, and that's a great assessment, because what you're doing is you're saying, I'm measuring this, and I'm going to predict whether or not you can do that in the future. So the point here of asking you this is, are these different assessments, are these different objectives in your current safety programs, are they that measurable? Are they that standardized? And most importantly, why we wanted to write down, is this measured? Because, is this something that's objective? Are these safety components, are these safety outcomes that are again, something that they're tracking to see, are these implemented, and if so, who's doing it, and what are the outcomes? So it's just like with HPI, what we're doing is we're using a test of personality to predict safety behavior, and it's a great complement to these other things. Somebody mentioned the test of lifting a heavy object, the driver's test, right? And a lot of that then in aggregate is used to inform safety climate surveys, which we haven't talked too much about, but again are important. So again, all great responses there. So just to wrap this up, I wanted to share a few ROI or success stories where we've gone in, validation studies where we've actually been able to go in, collect data, and show that Hogan moved the needle by implementing a particular safety profile or safety intervention in terms of selecting individuals. Here's a case study with a large metropolitan transportation company where we used a validation study for bus drivers. What we found was that bus drivers that this company hired that were rated high on safety also scored high or a high fit on our safety report. And so these individuals had fewer customer complaints, fewer accidents, fewer work comp claims. Again, this one's pretty straightforward. Here's another just very different example of a company here in the U.S., a plastics tube manufacturing company, where they looked at this in aggregate. So I wanted to include this. They used the climate survey to first start to understand where they needed to move the needle on changing the safety culture, and then essentially implemented our safety report and started doing individual development training. This was a situation where this particular company had been fined quite a bit from OSHA. They were able to reduce their fines, and then within 2 years brought down their lost time accident rates quite a bit. So again, situations where we're able to deploy Hogan and then through the organization collect data to be able to show that return. And we do that, all day, every day. That's Hogan's bread and butter. That's what we're here to do. We're a research company first and foremost. We're a test publisher. And so anytime you have at your respective companies the opportunity to link personality and actual performance or objective data, we welcome the opportunity to work with you through D-TECK there. And essentially be able to put out a study that's predicting, using your own data, individuals that would be, in this case, the top safety individuals. Again, you're looking at using the data from incumbents or your current population to produce a future-oriented job success profile. And I think it's essentially the best place you can ever be from a psychometrics perspective. But again, just to wrap this all up, you zoom out, the Hogan safety view of this is we're looking at starting with the assessment. So we're hiring the right employees at the start of this. We can use that same information, the same data, even the same report to coach them and develop them along the way and make sure that we've got a comprehensive approach to safety management. We're focusing on people in this case, not necessarily the systems, which I think, again, I think get blamed more than anything. Is the processes and procedures. Maybe the organization is saying they're not detailed enough, they're not standardized enough. right? I think that's typically where the burden gets shifted, is that we need to have more process and automation or documentation on this. But most of the time, companies are ignoring the individual component or the human component of this. And so again, recognizing risk-prone employees and coaching them around identifying and assessing those most likely to cause accidents. That's really what the bread and butter of this is. And then we're coaching people along the way to help develop their employees and to help them become more aware of safety behaviors.
Hey, I really appreciate that, Dustin. Sorry, I'm in a location and I've lost power, so I've kind of fallen off the webinar. And I can't read some of the questions that are coming in, but there was one question before we lost power and I disconnected. And the question was, we spoke a lot about, manufacturing types of roles and drivers and where people are, coming across, very heavy objects, very, sensitive objects. But where does Hogan sit on being able to use the safety assessment for, people in sales roles, people in roles, in light vehicle delivery, people that are required to be on the road for work?
Excellent question. Excellent question. And so my simple answer to that is you'd be looking at using the safety report, again, HPI assessment. If you've got a situation where you're working with people who are what I would just say on the front lines of safety behavior. So you're talking about the oil workers, the derrick workers, the roustabouts on the oil rig. You're talking about the truck drivers. You're talking about people on the assembly line or a large manufacturing organization, people that are handling dangerous equipment, right? So what we're focusing on are individuals that are in potentially dangerous lines of work or lines of work where there are implications for safety behavior, positive or negative. We're not talking about situations where you're looking at managers of those individuals. That's a separate, not assessment, but a separate report. And then in terms of sales, there we're looking at yet another profile. So you're essentially looking at a sales profile there. So which individuals are going to be more likely to make a sale? What are the personality characteristics of people that, are extroverted enough and direct enough to push for a sale? And in terms of the manager or leader, we're talking about essentially the characteristics that are required to build and maintain a high-performing team. What are the characteristics involved to be an emergent and effective leader? So it's the same components of personality that are driving all of this. Again, it comes from HPI. We're just looking at different scales and combinations of scales to predict different outcomes. That's a fantastic question.
Great. So you encourage organizations where there is a propensity to be able to hurt someone else or get hurt to be able to use the safety assessment. 100%,
100%. And again, we're not talking about replacing your current systems or the current methods that you have in place. We're not saying toss out the driver's test for truck drivers or the phone screen or the job interview or the drug test. We're just saying we can help you be more objective and increase the odds that you're going to hire somebody who can exhibit safe workplace behaviors at time one versus having to go back later and saying, wow, we should have looked at this personality component around safety before we hired somebody reckless in the air traffic control room or before we gave that police officer that weapon or that motorcycle, right? We're looking at different outcomes based on personality in the individual sense.
Great. Did you, I'm sorry, Dustin, again, I fell off because the building I'm in lost power, but do you see any other questions that have come in, or maybe Zach, you can interject with any other questions?
So I tell you what, while Zach's looking at that, why don't we go ahead and open it up to the chat question. So this is our final chat question here, just to wrap up the presentation. If you guys can type this in, what sorts of methods do you currently use regarding safety-related organizational training and development programs? And if you're involved, if you know that your organization's involved with anything on the selection on the front end, that's fantastic too. But for at least this one, what are you currently using for safety-related training and development? So we're getting some great responses here, looking like mostly communications training right now, and looking at individual in-person training, safety conferences, that's a good one. Yeah, here's another really great one, meetings at the beginning of a shift, which is, yeah, a great way, a great intervention to orient people to safe behaviors, paying attention, right? Take a few more seconds and see if anything else comes in. Yep, safety minute meetings before each shift. These are all great. And again, while a couple of these come through, just to draw your attention back to one I think of the most critical components is essentially the bottom bullet I have here on the slide, which is the climate survey. So those are all really fantastic methods, right, of training and awareness around current safety, let's just say behaviors. But if you zoom that out, right, what's the organizational attitude? What's the climate of safety at that particular organization? Maybe it's BP, maybe it's Exxon, right? We're talking about large companies. What's the safety climate around those things? And by surveying the entire organization, or let's just say a fair number of people in the hundreds, we can get a really clear picture of what's the attitude, what's the climate around survey here. And we can start to target which of our safety dimensions we should be looking at for development programs, and which of those dimensions might be the most important to focus on for selecting in individuals in the future that are more safety aware or conscious around those 1, 2, or 3 safety dimensions. So again, we'll have data, we'll have objective information to point us in the direction of which of these are going to be the most important. Okay.
Has there anything else come through, Dustin?
Nope.
Or all right?
Yeah, looks like that one's it.
Perfect. You know, at the same time, if anybody has any other questions, continue to add them. You've seen the emails come to us from info@D-TECK. If you want to get in connection with me to be able to kind of talk about this further and talk about the implications or how we can encompass this at your organization, please feel free to reach out. This slideshow that we did go through, this presentation, will be available to you. Later this afternoon, there's a small survey that goes out. Once that survey is complete, the slides are all sent to you for you to be able to review and have. Thank you, Dustin. Thank you very much. Zach, who's quiet, you know, thank you very much as well for being able to put this together. We really appreciate it. And for everybody in attendance, thank you. You know, please join us again, and you'll see a note from us relatively soon where we will be going over the individual reports available in the safety portfolio from Hogan, where we will walk you through the reports, what you're going to find, and how, and use cases for them. So just to wrap it up, thank you very much for attending. Complete the survey that you'll see this afternoon, and you can have the slides. Any other questions, concerns, comments, please then send them over to info@D-TECK. We look forward to working with you. And if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out. Thanks again, Dustin.
Okay. Yeah, thanks, everybody. Thanks, D-TECK. Thanks, Jag and Zach. And again, everybody, thank you for your time. Thanks for attending today. Really appreciate it.
Bye-bye.